Let's cover another concept in the World Wide Web called Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. First, let's look at what Hypertext Transfer Protocol is. I've mentioned it in earlier videos. Essentially, this is a protocol, a set of agreements about how to transmit and receive web page information. Hypertext is the actual language or format for web pages. Hypertext Transfer Protocol would be what's the protocol for transferring this hypertext data, this data about web pages, back and forth between computers. So, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, web pages back and forth. How do you do it? Now add secure on there and we're going to enter a whole new realm. We enter the realm of how can you attempt to make sure that the data going back and forth between a browser and a web server isn't made available to other people. Let me show you how that works. Take a look at the basic illustration here. We've gone over this several times. A browser, a web server. Browser issues requests for information. The web server sends back responses. The data that's sent back and forth is formatted according to the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Good. Now, let's say that someone in between here at the internet service provider decided they want to commit a not so nice act and take a look at the data going back and forth. And let's say that data was, your credit card information or your username and password for your websites. Or frankly, just anything you would prefer to be kept private. Thank you very much. That can be done. Physical equipment can be made that will actually intercept this data, be able to read it. So, now we enter the area of web security. How to attempt to keep the data you have transmitting back and forth between these machines to some degree safe from people who mean mischief. One of the methods is what's called encryption. Let me cover that really quickly. First of all, just what is encryption? Encryption is essentially taking data and modifying it so it cannot be easily read and understood, and specifically doing that so that the computer that sends the data and the computer that receives the data know the exact way you changed the data and can scramble it or unscramble it, if you will. Let me illustrate this. It's a very simplified explanation. Real encryption is a lot more complex than this. But here's the basics. Let's say the user was transmitting their username to a website. The username is John J. Now, you could encrypt or modify this data through a very, very simple method. We would add one letter to each of the letters here. We would say, okay, J. What's the next letter after J? Well, it's a K. What's the next letter after O? P. What's the next letter after H? I. What's the next letter after N? O. And again, letter after J is K. So the browser and the web server, let's say they know that this is the methodology we're going to use to encrypt or scramble our data. The web browser has you type in your John J, but it changes it to your KPIOK. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. It sends KPIOK as the username over to the web server. Now the web server knows that this browser has changed this, and it does it in reverse. It goes backward one letter and takes your KPIOK and turns into JOHNJ. That's encryption. And again, it relies on a couple of things. One, that the computer who's sending the data has a specific methodology for manipulating or encrypting the data. And two, that the receiving computer knows the methodology and is capable of reversing it to see what the actual data is. Now you can see that if some person in the middle here intercepted your data, they would have a KPIOK, which is utterly useless to them if they don't know the way that it was encrypted. Now again, this is a very simple mechanism for encryption. People probably take about 10 seconds to figure out what you did if they saw a few different usernames. So actual encryption methods are a lot more complex than this. But there's your basics of encryption. So how do you know if a web page that you're about to go to is secure? How do you know if the website it's part of is secure? Well, one of the things you can look for is this. Does it use a system called security certificates? Let me show you how that works. Here's a system that you've seen before, or a diagram you've seen before, with one addition. Browser, internet service provider, a web server. Then there's a different thing here. It's called a certificate authority. Let me show you what that is. A certificate authority is a company that specializes in checking into the websites on a web server and seeing to what degree they actually implement safe web practices, i.e., do they use really good encryption, as we covered earlier. So, let's say the people that have a web page on this web server want to be able to assure people that, hey, we're doing a good job in terms of your security, we've encrypted all the data that goes back and forth, we know what we're doing. They can apply to a company called a certificate authority, give them all their information about all their physical hardware, their web server, the fact that they're allowed to actually use that website name, everything, and goes over the details of how they encrypt their data. The certificate authority, this third-party company, they're not part of this system, they're separate. They, if they verify all the data from the website, can give the people that operate the website a little file called a certificate. Yes, that atrocious word is file. I'm sure that's really, really nice. So what's this certificate? It's an electronic file stored on the web server that confirms the data that the certificate authority verified. It says, yeah, absolutely. We checked into this website. We've checked all their hardware. We've checked that they're actual owners of the site. We've checked how they encrypt their data. They have our approval. Now, how does this system work in practice? The user issues a request for a web page from their browser to the internet service provider. Internet service provider says, oh, okay, well, that's over on this web server. But the browser did something different. It said, hey, listen, this time, when you receive or send data, please use the hypertext protocol secure. And that tells the internet service provider, oh, hold on. Hey, Mr. Web Server, before I even see that web page you have, can you please give me your certificate data? That certificate data comes to the internet service provider and it goes, oh, okay, well, this certificate comes from this certificate authority. Let's say they're called Acme. And it says to the Acme company, their computers, it says, hey, here's this certificate file for this website. Is this actually yours? Is this correct and true? If it is, then a yes gets sent back to the internet service provider. At which point it says, oh, good. This request that the guy made, yeah, okay, good. I'll request that now. Please give me that web page. Thank you. Okay, good. Now I'll send that web page back to the person that asked for it. If, on the other hand, this information is not what the certificate authority had on file, then it sends a no. At which point, the original request for the web page doesn't even get sent to the web server. So that data doesn't go back and forth. Nothing comes back except for an error message. And the traffic sent back and forth is allowed to be safe and secure. By the way, that process I just described is what's called a handshake. The handshake is a procedure by which machines that can connect verify whether or not they should actually connect and start transmitting data back and forth. So the internet service provider is basically the traffic cop back and forth to see, will this browser be allowed to connect all the way to this web server and get the data at once, the web pages at once? Until it verifies the security information on that certificate, it does not allow the connection. At the time it does approve it, you could say that a handshake has completed and been approved, and the computers can now actually connect. So a handshake is a term that describes the process whereby a secure connection is established in between computers. So here's the thing. The average user of the internet and the World Wide Web aren't going to be able to see behind the scenes to that whole system I just drew. They can see what's in their browser. How can you have a pretty good indication using a browser that the website you're about to navigate to doesn't in fact have some security protocols being in use? Let me show you. First of all, here's a browser. Up at the top, usually on a browser, is where you actually have your address bar. And this is the address for whatever site you happen to be looking at. Down here, this is where the actual display is. This is where you see the web page. So, a couple different things to look at. One, in the site address bar, does the web address actually say HTTPS? And then www.learncodinganywhere.com or whatever. The S is an indication that the system that this is connected to, the web page, does have some sort of security protocol in place. Another indication might be that the individual browser, there's lots of different browsers, remember a browser is just software and there's lots of them, might have some sort of a symbol to indicate it, like a padlock. This is quite a common one. Or it might have a green check mark. Again, it's an indication that there's some sort of security system in place down the line. Now, one final one, which is a little bit less trustworthy, but you'll see it often, is that somewhere in the web page, there might be, a padlock symbol. Or there might be the words SSL. That stands for Secure Socket Layer. And that's just a protocol for encryption. Remember the encryption that I showed you, really intelligent. Increment the letters by 1 and then decrement them by 1 when they're received. Well, there's a lot more complex ones. I mentioned that. One of them is Secure Socket Layer. It's a protocol for encrypting data. So here's the thing. You might see this SSL thing. You might see words that say secure. You might see a big green check mark. You might see a picture of a padlock. You might see a guy putting his thumb up. We're safe. None of it actually means necessarily anything. You can put whatever pictures and logos and words you want to on your web page. Now, if it's a reputable company and you feel reasonable trusting them, great. I recommend looking for, is it sent by secure hypertext transfer protocol? Is there a padlock that the browser has put on there? Not the web page, the browser software itself, which has some sort of idea what's being done down the line. Those things are a little more reliable as an indication that the website is using some sort of decent security protocol.